Hello, and welcome to Fear Noir. Before we begin, take a moment to leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I always enjoy reading them. If you enjoy slow, unsettling stories that gently draw you deeper into the darkness, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Get comfortable, let your body become still, and allow the noise of the outside world to melt into silence. Tonight, the darkness holds a story meant just for you. So close your eyes, listen carefully, and let yourself drift into Fear Noir. Story 1. I never really got along with my roommate. Looking back, I don't think he ever wanted me here at all. The first time I introduced myself, he nearly fell out of his chair. He was sitting at his desk, doing something quiet, and I came in and said hello. The shock on his face was something else entirely. I tried to laugh it off, tried to apologize and calm him down, but he stood up without a word and walked straight out of the room. I stood there for a moment, not really knowing what to think. Maybe he just needed a little time to adjust. New people can be startling. I told myself it would get better. It didn't. A few days later, I found him in the living room watching television. I thought that was a good sign, a normal thing, something we could share. I walked in and said, "Hey," asked him how his day was going. He didn't look at me. He just reached for the remote and turned the volume up until the sound coming out of the speakers was nothing but distortion, a wall of noise that made the whole room vibrate. I stood there for another moment, feeling stupid, and then I left him to it. I tried a few more times after that, different days, different approaches. He never responded. He never even acknowledged that I was in the room with him. Once I tapped him lightly on the shoulder, just trying to squeeze past him in the hallway, and he nearly went through the ceiling. He bolted to his room and slammed the door so hard the whole frame rattled. A few seconds later, I heard something heavy being dragged across the floorboards, something being pushed up against the door from the inside. I stood in the hallway and listened to it, and didn't know what to feel. His habits didn't make any of this easier to deal with. The house was a mess, and I mean a real mess. Dishes piled in the sink for days, crusting over with old food, dust collecting on every surface, because he never touched a cloth or a broom. The whole place had a kind of neglected, stale feeling to it, like the air itself had given up. But the strangest thing, the thing I kept coming back to, was the windows. He had covered every single one of them with old newspaper. Every window in the house, floor to ceiling, taped and layered until not a sliver of light could get through from outside. And the mirrors were all gone too, every single one. He had taken them down, and I have no idea where he put them, because there was nothing reflective anywhere in the house. No mirrors, no shiny surfaces, not even a piece of metal cutlery. Everything in the kitchen was plastic. Every last thing. I made the mistake of pulling at the newspaper on one of the windows once. Just curious. Just wanting a little natural light in the room. He came in and screamed at me. Not words, not a warning, just screaming until I stepped back and put my hands up and moved away from the window. He was shaking. His face was pale and his hands wouldn't stay still. He disappeared into his room for a while, and when I passed the window later, the newspaper had been replaced, freshly taped, good as new. After that, I kept to myself as much as I could. I would move through the house quietly and try not to be in whatever room he was in for too long. But the house wasn't that big, and we kept bumping into each other. I thought maybe if I announced myself before entering a room, warned him I was coming, it might ease things a little. So I started doing that, calling out where I was going before I got there. It seemed reasonable to me. It seemed kind even, but it made things worse. He started whispering to himself whenever I did it. Low, barely audible, the same kind of rhythm each time, over and over, like something he was repeating to keep himself steady. I could never make out the actual words. After a while, I stopped announcing myself. It wasn't helping anyone. At least, he never came near my room. Whatever his feelings about me were, my space was my own. And that was something. I spent more and more time up there, away from him and his strange rituals and his silence and his screaming. He was home all day, every day. And after a while, that started to feel suffocating. My room was the only place I could breathe. Then, one afternoon, there was a loud bang at the front door. Not a knock, a bang, like the door had been forced. And then it swung open, and there were multiple sets of footsteps downstairs. I stayed in my room. I didn't know who it was or what was happening. A woman's voice drifted up the stairs, soft and calm and professional sounding. There were a few more voices exchanged below me, and then another bang. And then I heard him, my roommate, sobbing. It was loud at first, and then it faded as he was moved toward the front of the house. And then I understood what was happening. I ran to the window at the front and tore the newspaper away from the glass and looked down into the street. There was an ambulance parked outside. He was being guided into the back of it, and a few neighbors had come out to watch, hands over their mouths, heads tilted down. I hadn't even known there were neighbors. I had never seen the street before. He was crying the whole time they loaded him in, and right before the doors closed, he turned and pointed back at the house, pointed directly at me, at the window where I was standing. One of the medics followed his gaze and looked up. They stood there for just a second, then shook it off like a chill passing through them, and turned back to close the doors. The ambulance pulled away. Nobody came back inside. Nobody came back for me. Just like that, I was alone. That was 3 days ago. I spent those 3 days waiting and wandering the empty house, and not really knowing what to do with myself. I had never liked him, not exactly, but he had been a constant presence, and without him, the house felt enormous and hollow. I was surprised by how much the absence bothered me. I hadn't expected that. On the 3rd day, I went into his room. I'm not proud of it. I had never gone in before. Not once. But I didn't know what else to do, and I needed something to make sense of. The door was wide open. The floorboards inside had deep, worn grooves running from the doorway to his dresser, like he had paced that same path thousands of times. The room was in a terrible state. Newspapers stacked in every corner, towers of them reaching halfway up the walls, empty takeout containers scattered across the floor, some of them growing dark and fuzzy with mold. There were flies somewhere in the room. I didn't look too hard for where they were coming from. The only clean surface in the entire room was his desk. A laptop sat open in the middle of it, and behind the laptop a corkboard was covered in pinned notes and printed pages. I sat down and tried to wake the laptop up. It asked for a password. I scanned the notes on the board looking for a clue, but before I even finished reading them, my fingers had already moved to the keys. Numbers. 6 of them. 0, 20226. The screen opened. The desktop was cluttered with saved documents and browser bookmarks. I clicked through some of them. There were pages on grief counseling, on coping with loss, on building routine after trauma. And then there were the more recent ones, pages about hallucinations, about unwanted presences, about spirits and how to remove them, about exorcisms. His coping strategies were clearly not holding. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, something close to guilt. I opened his saved journal. It started on the 28th of March. His therapist had suggested the journal. He wrote that with a kind of tired sarcasm, said nothing else had worked, so he might as well try it. He wrote about wanting the images to stop, about the smell of burning rubber, and something else he couldn't name. He wrote that he was sorry. He signed it Elias. I moved ahead a few days. By the 31st, he was writing about seeing something standing in the house and watching him. He said it didn't do anything. It just watched. He said he had blocked the windows because it was easier to cope in the dark. If he couldn't see it, maybe it would leave him alone. The 1st of April. It had spoken to him, said hello. He wrote that the voice sounded like an amalgamation of theirs, that his own imagination was being very cruel. He left the room and didn't know where it went afterward. The 2nd, he saw it move into the living room, sat near him on the couch. He kept his eyes on the television and turned the volume up so loud he couldn't hear it speak. He said he barely held himself together. The 3rd, it touched him. He was certain it wasn't in his head. He ran to his room and barricaded the door. The 4th, it had tried to peel the newspaper from the window. He had screamed until it stopped, and then he had looked at it. He wrote that he had stared for too long, and that he had been able to make out features. A nose from one of them, wide, innocent eyes from another. He wrote to his sweet boy that he was sorry for making him into this thing, and then said he needed to make it dark again. The 5th, he thought ignoring it was working. He seemed almost hopeful. He wrote that he was going to be okay. The 6th, the last real entry before everything fell apart. He wrote in capitals, frantic, shaking even through the text. It was telling him where it was in the house. Why would it do that? Why would it do that when he so clearly didn't want it there? And then the phrase, over and over, filling the rest of the page. I'll be okay. I'm going to be okay. I'll be okay. I'm going to be okay. It went on for pages. That must have been when they came for him. He must have still been typing when the door came open. I closed the journal. I reached over and pressed the power button. The screen went dark, and in the black mirror of it, I saw something I had not seen in a very long time. A reflection, my own reflection, looking back at me. A pair of wide eyes, slightly misaligned, staring out of a face I recognized, but couldn't quite place. I tilted my head to one side the way you do when something confuses you. The reflection tilted with me. I sat with that for a moment, and then I closed the laptop. There was one note on the corkboard, larger than all the others, a printed article, February 2nd, 2022. 6. A fatal crash on I-95. Father Soul survivor. The car in the photograph was unrecognizable, folded into something that no longer looked like a car. Beneath the article were two photographs, a woman, a young boy, small and bright-eyed and wide-eyed, in the way that children are. I recognized their faces. I know I did. I just can't explain how, or from where, or what exactly it means that I do. His name is Elias. I know that now, and I need him to come home. I've turned the laptop back on to write this out, to ask anyone who might know, where do they take people like that? People who scream a lot and stop eating and cover their windows and can't stop shaking. Is it a hospital? Can they come back from there? Because I need Elias to come back. I don't know why I never needed anything before he left, but I do now. Something has started that I don't have a word for, somewhere inside me, and it grows a little more each day he's gone. I need to tell him, I'm sorry. I think that's the word for it. I need to say it to his face, and I need him to hear me say it, even if he screams, even if he runs. I'll wait in whatever room he wants me to wait in. I'll stay out of his way. I'll do whatever he needs. I just need him to come back. I can't remember ever feeling hungry before, but I'm starting to feel it now. Story 2. It was the end of Ramadan in Malaysia, sometime in 2024, and the whole country was moving. That is the only way I can describe it. Every road, every bus terminal, every train station was packed with people trying to get back to their hometowns in time for Hari Raya. Families loading up cars, students dragging luggage through crowds, the air carrying that particular kind of excited chaos that only comes around once a year. I have always loved that energy from a distance, but I do not really have a hometown to go back to anymore. Both my grandparents passed away years ago, and with them went the house, the kampung, the whole idea of going home for Raya. So I usually just spent it with extended family in the city, which was fine. It was normal. It was what I knew. That year, I decided to head back a couple of days before Raya. My university had just wrapped up the last physical class before switching to online sessions for students who were traveling home early, which made sense given that the traffic during the Raya exodus is something close to a natural disaster. The roads get so congested it can turn a 3-hour drive into 6 or 7, and that is on a good day. I booked a night bus, thinking it would be smarter, that the worst of the traffic would have thinned out by then, and that I could just sleep through most of the ride. The journey from my university to the city usually takes somewhere between 6 and 7 hours, depending on conditions, with a few rest stops along the way. The kind Malaysians call RNR, where you can stretch your legs, use the bathroom, grab something from a vending machine or a small stall. My bus was scheduled to leave at 8 in the evening. It did not leave at 8. There was a delay, no explanation given, just waiting. And by the time we actually departed from the station, it was nearly 1 in the morning. The bus itself was a standard long-distance coach, the modern kind with reclining seats and overhead compartments and air conditioning that blows a little too cold. There were quite a few passengers on board, a mix of university students like myself and what looked like foreign workers heading into the city. But there were still some empty seats scattered throughout. It was not completely full. I found my row, settled in, and told myself I would be asleep within the hour. For the first part of the journey, we were on the main highway, the newer one with proper lighting and a steady flow of vehicles, even at that hour. But about an hour in, I noticed something had changed. The lights outside the window had thinned out and then disappeared almost entirely. The road had gotten narrower. The trees had moved in on both sides and were pressing close to the edges of the road, dark and dense. and unbroken. The bus had taken the old route, the back road that runs along the forest. Bus drivers sometimes use it to avoid the worst of the holiday traffic, and it does work for that purpose, but it is not a road that coaches usually bother with. It is narrow and poorly lit, and the kind of road where you would not want to break down at 2 in the morning. I told myself it was fine. The driver knew what he was doing. We had already passed one R&R and were apparently heading toward another one coming up. So when the bus slowed and pulled into a rest stop, I gathered my things and decided to use the bathroom. The R&R was not like the modern ones on the highway. Those are bright and noisy and smell like fast food even in the middle of the night. This one was old. The building had that classic Pondock style to it, the kind of architecture you see in photographs from decades ago, with jalousie windows, the louvered glass kind that you crank open in slats, and an open-air section where the roof did not fully close in the space below it. There were a few vending machines standing in the dim light near the entrance, their glow the brightest thing in the whole area. The forest sat right at the edge of the car park, thick and black and completely still. No wind, no sound except for the engine of the bus settling behind me. I got off and looked around and realized quickly that I was the only male passenger who had stepped off the bus. A few women had gone toward the female section, but the male bathroom was ahead of me, and I was walking toward it alone. I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just a bathroom at a rest stop. It was Ramadan, which meant that, according to belief, the demons and bad spirits are bound during the holy month, locked away, unable to do anything. There was nothing to worry about. I repeated this to myself as I walked into the bathroom. It was dimly lit inside and larger than I expected, a row of stalls running along one wall. I picked one near the middle and went in and did what I needed to do. While I was in there, I heard the door to the stall next to mine open and close. Someone else had come in, normal. I ignored it and finished up, but when I stepped out and turned to wash my hands, the door to the stall beside mine was hanging wide open, not slightly ajar, wide open, no one inside, no sound of footsteps leaving. The door had not swung open while I was at the sink because I would have heard it. It had just been open, like it had always been open, like no one had ever gone in. I stood at the sink and felt my skin go cold. I kept telling myself it was Ramadan. Nothing should happen. There was a rational explanation. Maybe I had imagined the sound of the door. Maybe the latch was broken and the door had just drifted shut and then back open on its own. I was almost done convincing myself when the last stall at the far end of the bathroom, the one furthest from the entrance, slammed shut. The sound of it exploded through the tiled space, and the echo bounced off every wall and came back at me from 3 different directions at once. There had been no one in that stall. I had seen all the doors when I walked in. They had all been open. I did not dry my hands. I did not look at the last stall. I walked out of that bathroom as fast as I could without actually breaking into a sprint, crossed the car park, and got back onto the bus. I found my seat, sat down, and stared at the seat back in front of me, while my heartbeat slowly came back to something normal. It is Ramadan, I told myself again. It is Ramadan, and nothing bad happens during Ramadan. I had imagined it, or misheard it, or some perfectly ordinary thing had happened, and my tired, anxious brain had turned it into something frightening. The bus attendant began doing the head count before departure. I watched him move down the aisle, quietly counting under his breath, touching the back of each seat as he passed. He reached my row and counted. He included the seats next to mine, both of them. I frowned and looked beside me. Both seats were empty. They had been empty since I boarded. No one had sat in my row at any point during the journey. I looked back at the attendant, and he was already moving forward, finishing his count. I heard him say, 24. I sat up and started counting the passengers I could see from my seat. I went carefully, making sure I was not missing anyone, checking both sides of the aisle, looking toward the back. I counted 22. I counted again. 22. The two seats next to me were empty, and I was the only person in my row, and yet the attendant had counted 24. I felt something drop in my chest. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark and watched the forest go by outside, and tried very hard not to think about what I had counted. About 2 hours into this, when I had exhausted every mental distraction I could think of, the attendant came down the aisle toward me. He stopped at my row and leaned in slightly and asked in Malay whether I would be willing to switch seats. I asked him where he wanted me to move. He said just to the seat beside me, that the Maxic had asked to switch because she wanted to look out the window. I did not understand what he was saying at first. I looked at him, and then I looked at where he was pointing, which was directly at the empty seat next to mine. There was no Maxic. A Maxic is an older woman, an auntie, a term of respect for someone of that generation. There was no older woman anywhere near my row. There were no passengers at all in my row. I looked at the attendant and told him as calmly as I could manage that the Maxic had always been sitting in the seat across from mine. He looked confused. He said, of course, I had noticed her. There was a Mac-chick with her child. She had been there the whole trip. I told him there had been no one sitting there. From the moment I boarded until right now, those seats had been empty. I was the only one in the row. I had been alone in the row the entire journey. The attendant's expression changed. He went very still, and then he looked back down the aisle toward the seats I was pointing at. He started counting again. I heard his lips moving. I heard him reach 22. He stopped. He stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and then he turned back to me, apologized quietly, and walked quickly to the front of the bus. His hands were not steady. I picked up my bag and moved to an empty seat a few rows ahead. I was not sitting in that row anymore. I did not care what anyone thought. What happened after that is harder to describe because it was less about specific events and more about how everything felt. The atmosphere inside the bus changed. The only word I have for it is hostile. The air felt wrong in a way I cannot explain with temperature or humidity or anything measurable. It just felt like the space had turned against us, and whatever I was feeling, the other passengers were feeling it too, because within a short time after my exchange with the attendant, people who had been deeply asleep were waking up and staying awake. No one was looking at their phones or talking. People were just sitting quietly in the dark, eyes open, facing forward. The tapping started not long after that, against the windows, irregular and light at first, like fingers trailing along glass as the bus moved, and then louder and more deliberate, and somewhere outside, not close but not far enough, there was a sound that in Malay we call mengilai, a high, thin laughter, the kind that sounds almost human, but sits just slightly wrong in pitch, coming and going in the distance as the bus moved through the forest. The bus did not stop at any more R&Rs. It did not slow down. The driver took us straight through to the city without another break. When we finally pulled into the station and the bus came to a stop and the lights inside flickered on, people began moving toward the exit in silence. As I stood to gather my things, I noticed the windows. The outside of the bus was marked with long scratches running along the panels, the kind of marks that suggested something had been dragging against the metal as we drove, and the windows were completely fogged over, every single one of them. Thick condensation covering the glass entirely. The outside temperature was 32 degrees. There was no reason for the windows to be fogged. There was no logical reason at all. I was near the exit when I turned back to look at the bus one more time. I do not know why I turned around. I wish I had not. There was a Mexican sitting in my original seat. She was sitting upright and completely still, and she was smiling, and in her lap she was holding what looked like a tombstone. Her eyes were not right. They were hollow in a way that I cannot describe accurately. Like the space where her eyes should have been was just darkness, just empty. She lifted one hand and waved at us, slow and deliberate, still smiling. And then from somewhere inside the bus, from no specific direction I could identify, came the sound of a child crying. I walked out of that station and I did not look behind me again. I have not taken a night bus since. I do not plan to. Story 3. I did not plan on writing anything else so soon, but something happened last night, and I have been sitting with it all day, and I do not know what else to do except write it down, because putting it somewhere outside of my own head is the only thing that makes it feel even slightly manageable right now. A few people who read my last post told me to go back and look more carefully at the photo I mentioned. I had been avoiding it. I knew I had been avoiding it, and I was fine with that. I thought I was being smart about it. But eventually, I gave in the way you always give in to the thing you know you should leave alone. I opened the photo again, and I looked at it properly for the first time. The first time I saw it, my eyes had gone straight to the words scratched into the wall and stopped there. That was all my brain had been willing to take in. But when I opened the image again and started zooming in, I realized that the words were only a small part of what was there. The marks on the wall were layered. There were older ones underneath, cut deeper, and newer ones on top. And some of them did not look like they had been made with anything sharp at all. They looked dragged, uneven and stretched in a way that made me think of something soft being pulled across the surface over and over, not carving, but pressing, like something that did not have the right kind of edges for the job, but kept trying anyway. I stared at that for a while and felt my stomach turn. And then I noticed the corner of the frame. There was something near the doorway. I had seen it the first time, and my brain had filed it away as a shadow, because the lighting in that room had always been bad, and shadows collecting in corners is just what happens in places like that. But when I adjusted the brightness on my phone, it did not behave the way a shadow should. It did not spread or thin out or blend into the wall around it. It kept its shape. It held together, and the shape it held was wrong in a specific way that I keep coming back to. It was too tall for the doorway. It was bent slightly, like it was having to fold itself to fit, like the space was not quite big enough for whatever it was. I looked at that shape for a long time and tried to find the rational explanation, and I could not find one that satisfied me. What made it worse was that I do not remember seeing anything in that doorway when I was standing in that room. I do not even remember taking the photo clearly. The whole thing had been quick and thoughtless. Phone up, click, let's go, let's get out of here. Which is part of why what happened next hit me the way it did. I was about to close the app when I saw it. There were 2 photos. I only took one. The second photo was taken from the hallway, from outside the room, angled slightly inward through the doorway, toward where I had been standing. You can see part of my shoulder in it, and my hand holding my phone up to take the first picture. Someone was standing behind me in that hallway. Someone was standing there and pointing a camera at my back while I was focused on the wall in front of me, and I did not notice, and I have no memory of it, and I did not take that photo. I checked the timestamps. I checked them multiple times because I needed there to be an error, a glitch, some kind of technical reason for what I was seeing. The 2 photos were taken seconds apart, not minutes. Seconds. I did not sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I went back to that moment at the top of the stairs. The door slightly open. The sound of breathing on the other side. The way it said, my name. I have been thinking about that moment more than anything else. And the thing that keeps bothering me, the thing I cannot shake, is that it did not sound threatening. It did not sound like a warning, or a growl, or something that wanted to frighten me. It sounded familiar. It sounded like something that already knew who I was, something that had known for a while, something that was simply acknowledging my presence the way you acknowledge someone you have been waiting on. That is so much worse than if it had sounded angry. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. I lay still for a few seconds thinking it was coming from outside, someone in the corridor of the building or on the street below. But the longer I listened, the more I understood that it was not outside. It was inside the apartment. And it was the same sound, the same slow, dragging rhythm I had heard in that building upstairs, that particular cadence of something being pulled along a surface. It stopped. I held my breath. Then it started again, a little closer this time, and I forced myself to get up because I knew that if I lay there and did nothing, I would never be able to stay in that apartment again. The hallway was empty. Every door was exactly as I had left it. Nothing was open, nothing was moved, nothing looked wrong. I stood there in the dark and listened, and there was nothing. I went back to my room. My phone was on the floor in the middle of the room. I had left it on my desk. I know I had left it on my desk because I had placed it there deliberately, face down, after looking at the photos, because I did not want the screen to light up while I was trying to sleep. It was on the floor now, and the screen was still on, which it should not have been, and the gallery was open, and the second photo was on the screen. I picked it up and looked at it, and it took me a moment to understand what I was seeing because my eyes kept insisting that everything was the same as before. But it was not the same. The doorway in the photo was not empty anymore. There was something in it, visible now in a way it had not been in the original image. Just part of it, long and thin and wrong, in the same way the shape in the corner had been wrong, like the proportions were off in a direction that does not have a name. It was leaning further into the room than it had been before. Like it had moved, like it was still moving, just slowly enough that you would only notice if you compared. I dropped the phone. I did not mean to. My hands just let go of it, and I left it on the floor and got back into bed and lay there with the lights on until morning. I have not opened the photo again. I do not want to see what might have changed a second time. But here is the part I do not know how to talk about without sounding like I have completely lost it. Something else has been happening alongside all of this, and I do not think it is unrelated, even though I cannot explain the connection. I have been hungry. Not regular hunger. I have been eating normally, keeping to my usual routine, and it does not matter. The hunger does not go away. It just sits there underneath everything else, constant and low and unsatisfied, like something in me is looking for something that food is not going to fix. It does not feel like a symptom of stress or poor sleep, though I know that is the reasonable explanation. It feels like something that is coming from outside of me and landing inside me, if that makes any sense at all. Like a need that does not belong to me, but that I am being made to carry. The worst part is that it feels like something I have felt before. It reminds me of the period after the flood, when everything fell apart, and I was in a bad way, and my body was running on empty in every sense. I do not want to go into that part of things yet, but my body remembers it, even when I am trying not to, and this hunger feels like the same frequency, like a signal I recognize but was hoping I would never have to receive again. I do not think whatever was in that building stayed there when I left. I have been trying to figure out how to frame this in a way that sounds like I have thought it through carefully rather than panicked my way to a conclusion. But the honest version is this. Either something followed me home, or something was already here, and being in that building woke it up, reminded it that I existed, pointed it back in my direction. I do not know which of those options is worse. Earlier today I checked my reflection. I do not know exactly why. I was passing the bathroom, and something pulled my attention toward the mirror, and I stopped and looked. For a moment, everything was completely normal. Just me, looking tired and a little pale. Exactly what I expected to see. And then, it was not normal. It lasted only a second, maybe less. But in that second, my reflection was smiling. Not a small smile, not ambiguous, a smile that I was not making, on a face that looked like mine, but was arranged in a way I did not recognize. And then it was gone, and my reflection was just my reflection again, and I was standing in the bathroom doorway, feeling like the floor had dropped an inch beneath my feet. I have the lights on tonight, every light in the apartment. I know that is not going to be enough. I know light does not actually do anything except make it slightly harder to imagine what might be in the corners. But it is what I have right now, so I am using it. I need to know if anyone has experienced this after going back to a place like that, after walking through a space that holds something, and then walking back out and bringing the feeling home with you. I need to know if it fades, if there is something to do about it, if this is a known thing with a known shape that people have found their way through, because I am not convinced anymore that this is only happening in my head, and I am not convinced it is only happening outside of me either. It is somewhere in between, and it is patient, and it feels like it is getting closer in the way that something gets closer when it is not rushing because it already knows it is going to arrive. I am keeping the lights on. I do not think it will help, but I am keeping them on anyway. Story 4. The listing was on Craigslist, 4 lines long, and completely unremarkable in the way that certain things are unremarkable right up until they aren't. Night shift caretaker needed. No experience required. $600 a week. Flexible hours. I read it on my phone, lying on the bed of a motel room that smelled like carpet cleaner and other people's regrets. And I called the number before I had finished thinking it through, which was not unusual for me at that point in my life. Thinking things through had not been serving me especially well. I was 53 years old, 2 months out of a marriage that had taken a long time to die and a short time to end. I was living in a place that charged by the week and had an ice machine at the end of the hall that made a sound like someone clearing their throat every 20 minutes all night long. I was not in a position to have standards. What I had was a phone and a Craigslist listing, and the particular kind of desperation that doesn't feel dramatic anymore, just quiet and constant, like weather. He called instead of emailing, which I noticed. His name was Daniel. His voice was one of those voices that sits completely flat and even no matter what it's saying, the kind of voice that reads you traffic updates or the weather forecast. Pleasant and informative, and not especially invested. He told me the property just needed someone present overnight, that he traveled for work and didn't like the house sitting empty. I asked what kind of property it was, and he said a large one, as though that answered the question, and somehow I let it pass. He sent $400 to my account before I had even seen the place. The note attached to the transfer said, "For your trouble so far." I called him back immediately because that didn't make sense to me, and at that stage of my life, I was still trying to make things make sense. I told him I hadn't done anything yet. There hadn't been any trouble. He said I had answered. He said that counted. The first errand was simple enough in the way that first things often are. He texted me an address, a storage facility on the edge of town, and told me to pick up a unit key from the front desk, take a green duffel bag from Unit 14, and drive it to his house. He would send the garage code in a follow-up message. The woman at the front desk handed me the key without asking my name, without looking up from what she was doing, as though this was the kind of transaction she completed a dozen times a day. The bag was lighter than I expected. It smelled faintly of something chemical, not the chemical of anything illegal. More the chemical of a hardware store, something industrial and clean, and slightly sharp in the nostrils. I put it in my back seat and drove to his house. It was large the way he had said, set well back from the road, behind a long gravel driveway, and the motion lights clicked on before I had even fully turned in, which meant they were calibrated to catch things early. I punched in the code, put the bag on the workbench in the garage, exactly where he had specified, and was backing out when the follow-up text arrived. He thanked me and then told me one thing. If I ever arrived at the house and saw a white sedan parked across the street, I was to drive past without stopping, text him immediately, and wait for his response before doing anything else. I sat in the driveway and read that twice. Then I wrote back that I understood, and I drove away. And I did not ask any questions about the white sedan, or what it meant, or who might be in it, because I had already understood something about Daniel by that point, which was that he operated in spaces he wasn't going to explain to me, and that my job was to be reliable within those spaces without requiring a map of them. Over the following 2 months, I ran maybe a dozen errands. I drove documents to a law office, and was told to leave the envelope at the front desk without speaking to anyone inside. I picked up a gray Honda from a parking garage downtown, completely nondescript, the kind of car that disappears in any parking lot, and drove it to his garage, where it sat alongside his other vehicles as though it had always been there. Once, he asked me to meet a man named Terrence at a diner, sit with him for exactly 45 minutes, and then leave without the envelope that Terrence would bring to the table. I asked Daniel what was in the envelope. He told me not to look in it. I told him I hadn't planned to. He said he knew. He said he was telling me anyway. By the time the overnight request came, I had made close to $4,000. I had not asked where the money came from. I had decided at some point, without making a formal decision about it, that the answer to that question was probably not something that would make my life simpler or better, and that the money itself was real, and the motel room was real, and those were the coordinates of my actual situation. He texted on a Thursday. He needed me to spend Friday night at the house. He would pay $900. There were instructions on the kitchen counter. I drove over that evening. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the front room, which gave it the look of a house that was just barely occupied, just barely inhabited, maintaining the minimum conditions for appearing lived in. I punched in the door code, went inside, and found the instructions on the kitchen counter exactly where he had said, held flat by a ceramic coffee mug, as though the paper might otherwise drift away. He welcomed me and thanked me, and then he gave me the rules. Lock the deadbolt when you arrive. Lock it again before you sleep. The phone in the study rings sometimes at night. Do not answer it. It will stop on its own. The back bedroom blinds stay closed. Do not open them. That room stays dark. If someone knocks after 11 at night, do not respond. Do not turn on any lights and wait a full 15 minutes after the knocking stops before you move. The man who handles the exterior lights checks the property around 2 in the morning and will shine a light through the front windows. This is normal and expected and not a reason for alarm. There is a radio in the hallway closet. Turn it on before you sleep. Set it to AM static. Leave the volume at 4 and do not turn it off under any circumstances. If the motion light above the garage activates between midnight and 3 in the morning, go directly to the study, close the door, and stay there until the light goes off. Do not open the door at the bottom of the basement stairs for any reason. There is no reason to go down there. Then he told me to help myself to the kitchen, mentioned a good blanket on the armchair, and wished me good night. I read the list twice, standing at the counter. Then I poured myself a glass of water and read it a third time. I stood there with the water and thought about each item individually and tried to build a picture from them the way you build a picture from the negative space in. Things when the thing itself isn't visible. The phone that rings and stops. The blinds that stay closed. The knocking rule with its specific 15-minute waiting period. The radio, which had to stay on all night at a precise volume. The basement door. I thought about the gray Honda and Terrence, and the envelope in the white sedan, and I came to the conclusion I had been gradually arriving at for 2 months, which was that Daniel existed in margins I was not meant to fully see, and that my job was not to see them, but to function correctly within them. So I did what the list said. The phone in the study rang at 9:47, twice, clean and deliberate, and then it stopped. I was in the armchair with the blanket, and I sat still and listened to the silence that came after it, and did not move toward the study. At 11:30, someone knocked at the front door. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more knocks, then a voice, a man's voice, casual and familiar, calling out Daniel's name and identifying himself as Phil, telling Daniel to open up in the tone of someone who had stood on this doorstep before and expected the door to open. I was sitting in the armchair in the dark, and I stayed in the armchair in the dark. I did not move, and I did not breathe loudly, and I counted my own heartbeats, because that was the only clock I had access to, without moving. After a while, the voice stopped, and after a while, the silence settled back into place, and I counted 15 minutes on my watch, watching the second hand make its slow circuits, before I allowed myself to get up and go to the kitchen for water. The motion light above the garage came on at 1:17 in the morning. I had been lying down, but I was not fully asleep, and I saw it through the gap at the edge of the curtain, the sudden wash of white light cutting across the ceiling. I got up, went to the study, closed the door behind me, and sat on the floor with my back against the desk the way the rule implied, away from the door, away from the window. The light stayed on for 11 minutes. I know the exact duration because I watched the minutes change on my phone, sitting on the floor in the dark, not reading anything, not doing anything, just watching the numbers and waiting. The light went off. I stayed where I was for a few minutes longer. Then I went back to the armchair, and at some point, I fell asleep. I never went near the basement door. The thought of it crossed my mind once, around 2 in the morning. The particular way a forbidden thing presents itself to the mind in the small hours, not as temptation exactly, but as a kind of gravitational awareness, a knowledge of where it is and what stands between you and it. I let the thought pass and stayed where I was. In the morning there was a coffee maker already prepared and a note beside it telling me to press brew and thanking me again. The $900 arrived in my account before the coffee finished brewing. Daniel was not in the house. He texted around 10 to ask if everything had gone well, told me he was heading back the following day, said he was giving me a week off from errands, and that I had been reliable, and he meant that. I was sitting in my car in the driveway when I read his message. I had gone back after leaving to check that I had locked everything properly, an old habit from the end of my marriage, when I had developed the compulsion of checking things twice, as though being careful a second time could compensate for all the times being careful once hadn't been enough. I texted back that everything was fine. Then I sat there looking at the house, and I thought about the radio. I thought about Rule 6, the one that said to turn it on before sleeping. AM static, volume at 4. Do not turn it off. I thought about how I had followed that rule, how I had gone to the hallway closet and found the radio and turned it on and set it the way he specified, and listened to the soft, continuous hiss of it as I settled into the armchair. And I thought about how at some point during the night, I couldn't identify exactly when, I had surfaced briefly from sleep, and the house was completely silent. No static, no hiss, nothing. I had registered this in the foggy, half-aware way of someone not fully awake, and told myself the radio had turned off on its own. Old equipment. These things happen, and I had let myself sink back down into sleep without getting up to check it. I sat with that in the driveway. I sat with the specific quality of that silence and what it meant in the context of the rule. and why the rule existed. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message asked if I had slept well. I stared at it. Before I could decide whether or how to respond, a second message arrived from the same number. It said the static was important, that it covered sound, that when it went off, you could hear things you weren't supposed to hear. I did not answer. My hands were still, and my eyes were on the screen, and I was thinking about the 11 minutes the motion light had been on, and the 15 minutes I had counted. After the knocking stopped, and the way the study door had been closed behind me, while I sat on the floor with my back against the desk, the third message was a photograph, dark and grainy, taken in very low light, the kind of image a phone produces when it is trying to capture something in near darkness and not quite succeeding. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. It was the study. The door was closed. The image was taken from inside the room, angled toward the bottom of the door, where a thin strip of slightly lighter darkness was visible at the floor level. There was a shadow in that strip. Something was standing on the other side of the door. The shape of the shadow was wrong in ways I did not want to look at too closely. Wrong in its proportions. Wrong in the way it fell. Wrong in some quality I could not name precisely, but felt immediately and completely. I had been on the floor on the other side of the room with my back against the desk when that photograph was taken. The shadow was not mine. The final message came through a few seconds after I had finished looking at the photograph. It said, "Good thing you stayed put. I have not responded to that number. I have not asked Daniel about it. I have not gone back to the house since that morning, though he has texted twice with what he describes as simple errands, easy things. Nothing like the overnight. I keep thinking about the radio and the silence and the 11 minutes and the shape and the gap under the door. I keep thinking about how the rules were not arbitrary, how each one of them was specific in a way that specificity comes from experience, from knowing exactly what happens if you do the wrong thing or fail to do the right one. I keep thinking about how I followed every rule except the one I followed badly, the one about the radio, the one I only half followed because I was asleep when it stopped and did not get up to fix it. I keep thinking about what I might have heard if I had been awake when the static cut out. I have not decided yet whether I am going back. The motel is still charging by the week, and the ice machine is still clearing its throat every 20 minutes, and I am still 53 years old, with nowhere particular to be. But I have not decided yet. Story 5. I was in my second year of college when this happened. I had a small house not too far from campus, cheap enough that I could manage it on my own, which became the situation by default after the friends I had planned to live with backed out just before the school year started. The loneliness was something I adjusted to without too much trouble. It was the rent doing most of the damage, quietly bleeding me every month. But I made it work, and the house was mine, and I had my dog, and that was enough. Those were the years when online chat rooms were really hitting their stride. Audio chat had become normal. Video was starting to catch up, and if you had a laptop and a decent connection, you could spend an entire evening talking to people from all over the place. I had gotten a laptop for school, and it did not take long before I was using it for that just as much as for anything academic. I met a lot of people through those sites. Some of them I am still in contact with today. People who became real friends over time, which tells you that not everything about that era of the internet was bad. Most of it was fine. Most of it was genuinely good. Actually, Then there was the night I met Chris. I had gotten home from a night class, gone through the usual routine of dropping my bag and opening the laptop, and spent a couple of hours moving between different voice chats and servers. It was late and winding down when I ended up in a conversation with this guy. He said his name was Chris. We talked for maybe 45 minutes, easy conversation, college stuff mostly, nothing that went too deep. It turned out he went to one of my school's rival schools, which gave us a comfortable amount of material to work with. The kind of friendly rivalry talk that feels like instant common ground with a stranger. He seemed normal. He seemed like exactly the kind of person you met on those sites. Someone your own age going through the same general experience of trying to get through school. At some point, I mentioned offhandedly that my computer had been acting up, nothing serious, just one of those irritating issues that slows things down and sits in the back of your mind. Chris told me he was studying IT and offered to take a look. I said sure without thinking much about it. He sent me a link and told me to install the application it pointed to. I looked at the site for a moment, and nothing about it set off any alarm. It did not look suspicious. It did not look like anything other than what he said it was. So I installed it and followed the steps he walked me through. What happened next was genuinely strange to experience, even if it was perfectly explainable. The application gave Chris remote access to my computer. My mouse started moving on its own, going where he was directing it, clicking through things, opening menus, doing whatever he needed to do to look at the issue. I sat back and watched it happen, this cursor gliding around the screen without my hand anywhere near it. It was unsettling in a low-key way, even knowing the reason for it, like watching someone else inhabit your space. But I let it go. He knew what he was doing, or seemed to, and I appreciated the help. At some point, I had to step away to let my dog in for the night. It only took a few minutes, maybe less. I went downstairs, opened the back door, let her in, came back up. When I walked back into my room, I saw something on the laptop screen close quickly, not slowly, not naturally, but the way you close something when you do not want it to be seen. I stood there for a second, and then I told myself Chris was just navigating around, doing whatever tech people do when they are working on a machine remotely, and that I had probably caught him mid-step in the process. I let it go. I asked him if the issue was fixed. He said yes. I thanked him and told him I needed to sleep because it was getting late. I meant it, genuinely. I thought he was good company, the kind of person worth talking to again. So before I closed out, we made a loose plan to chat again sometime. Then I shut everything down, put the laptop to sleep, and went to bed. I slept for a few hours. When I opened my eyes, the room was still dark outside, and the first thing I registered was that my room was lit up. The laptop was on. The screen was glowing across the walls and ceiling, and I lay there for a moment trying to work out how that was possible, because I had put it to sleep myself. I had watched it go dark before I got into bed. I got up and sat down in front of it. The desktop was just sitting there, my background image, nothing open, nothing obviously wrong. I reached for the mouse to put it back to sleep. The mouse did not move. I clicked it again. I moved it back and forth across the pad, and nothing on the screen responded. Completely frozen. I kept trying, clicking repeatedly, trying to force something to happen, getting more frustrated and more awake and more alert with every second that passed, and nothing changed. Then an image filled the screen. It took my eyes a moment to adjust because it was dark, darker than the room around me, and my brain was still catching up to the situation. When I understood what I was looking at, something cold moved through me from the top of my head downward. It was a photo of my room, my empty room, taken from the angle of the laptop camera, showing everything behind me in the dark. I hit escape. I tried Control-Alt-Delete. Nothing responded. Nothing happened. The image just sat there on the screen, and I sat in front of it with my hands going cold. Another image replaced it. This one was me. It was a photo of me, sitting exactly where I was sitting, taken from the camera on the laptop, taken what looked like seconds ago. My face in the image was not doing anything dramatic. I was just sitting there. But seeing yourself photographed without your knowledge or consent, without any warning, in your own home at 3:30 in the morning, does something to your understanding of how safe you are. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I looked up slowly at the camera on the laptop and saw the small indicator light beside it. It was on. It had been on for who knows how long. The camera was running, and someone was on the other end of it, watching me sit in my dark room in my house that I had thought was private, that I had thought was mine. A video appeared on the screen. There was a play button in the center of it. The thumbnail was me again, and my face in it was doing something I did not want to examine too closely. The mouse began to move on its own. It slid across the screen toward the play button with a slow and deliberate steadiness that made my stomach drop, because there was nothing accidental about it, nothing technical or glitchy. It was being moved by someone who knew exactly where they were going. I did not wait for it to click. I put one hand over the camera and pressed the power button with the other, and I held it. I held it for what felt like a very long time, long enough that my hand was shaking. And in the last second before the screen went dark, one more image appeared. It was there for only a moment, low quality, slightly grainy in the way that photos taken in poor light always are. It was the outside of my house, taken in the dark, from close enough that whoever took it was standing on or near my property. The screen went black. The room went dark. I sat in it and did not move. My dog started barking from downstairs. She was not a dog that barked much. She was calm and quiet by nature, and it took a lot to get a reaction out of her, which is part of why the sound hit me the way it did. She was going hard, the kind of aggressive and sustained barking that means she had found something real, something that had gotten her attention and was holding it. I sat at the desk and thought about what was on the other side of the door downstairs, and what I was supposed to do about it, and whether the locks on the windows and doors were as solid as I had always assumed. The barking slowed, then it stopped, then there was nothing, just the house, quiet, and me sitting in the dark in front a laptop screen that had gone black. I did not go back to sleep. When morning came, I packed what I needed and moved into a hotel. I stayed there while I found somewhere else to go, because I could not make myself go back to that house, not to sleep in it, not knowing what I now knew about how exposed it had been. I never spoke to Chris again. I never found out his real name or whether Chris was even a name attached to a real person. I never found out what he had put on that laptop or what he had accessed or what he had done in those minutes when I was downstairs letting my dog in and my screen was unattended. I had school files on that laptop that I had not backed up anywhere. Assignments, notes, work I needed. I could not bring myself to turn it on again. I accepted that the files were gone, and I started over on them, because the alternative was sitting in front of that screen and waiting to see what it would show me. Eventually, I drove out somewhere quiet, and I set the laptop on fire. I watched it burn until there was nothing left that could be turned on, nothing that could wake up in the middle of the night and fill a dark room with its light, nothing that anyone could sit behind and look through at me without my knowing. I stood there until it was done. I have thought about that night more times than I can count, about how ordinary it all felt up until the moment it did not, about how easy it was, how natural to trust a stranger on the internet who seemed normal and offered something helpful, about the minutes I spent downstairs with my dog while someone sat on the other side of a remote connection and did whatever they needed to do with my camera and my files and my screen, about the photo of the outside of my house taken in the dark, about whether whoever took that photo was still outside when the barking started, about why the barking stopped. Story 6. I get to work and he is already there. That is the first thing, the thing everything else comes from, the detail I keep returning to, no matter how many times I try to think my way through what happened that night. He was already there when I arrived, which never happens because Nick is the kind of person who runs late to everything, who has been running late to everything for the entire time I have known him, who treats punctuality as a vague suggestion made by other people for other people. But there he was, standing in the break room like he had been there for a while, relaxed and comfortable, like early was just how he was now. We work the night shift at a water treatment plant. It is exactly the kind of job that sounds more interesting than it is, which is to say, it is mostly quiet and mostly boring, and mostly consists of making sure nothing goes wrong with systems that were designed specifically to not go wrong. 2 of us on through the night, checking readings, doing rounds, keeping an eye on monitors, drinking bad coffee, waiting for morning. It is the kind of job you take when you need steady and don't need exciting. And for the most part, it delivers on that exactly. Nick told me the day crew hadn't had any issues. Clean handoff, nothing to watch for. Should be an easy one. I told him I hoped he was right, because the nights had been wearing on me. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with a weekend, the kind that gets into your bones and stays. We talked for maybe a minute, the ordinary nothing talk of 2 people starting a shift together. And then I went into the little kitchen we have off the main room to put my food in the fridge. My phone buzzed while I was standing there with the fridge door open. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The text was from Nick. I almost laughed because I assumed he was doing something, sending me a meme or a link to something stupid, the kind of thing he did to fill the slow hours. But the message stopped me before I could smile at it. Sorry man, running late. It said, I'll be there in 5 minutes. I read it twice. I looked up at the kitchen doorway. I looked back down at the phone. I read it a 3rd time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. There are explanations for things like this. Delayed texts happen. Service is bad in certain areas. Messages sit in a queue and then arrive all at once when a signal finally connects. That was the first place my mind went. The rational shelf where you put things that don't fit immediately. But the explanation didn't hold. Nick had been here before me. He had gotten here early, which was already strange enough on its own. And we had spoken, a real conversation, face to face, about the day shift handoff. A delayed text from when he left his apartment didn't cover the timeline. The math was wrong. I walked back out into the main room. He wasn't there. I looked around the space carefully, the monitors, the desk, the doors, all of it. No Nick. I tried to reconstruct the last few minutes with some precision and found that the edges of the memory were less solid than I wanted them to be. Had I seen his car in the lot when I pulled in, I couldn't bring up a clear image of it. I had been tired running on not enough sleep, and I hadn't been paying attention to the parking lot the way I would have if I'd had any reason to. I had just walked in. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I walked into an empty break room, started a conversation with no one, and then continued that conversation for a full minute before going to the kitchen? That line of thinking had a destination I didn't want to arrive at, so I pulled back from it and looked at the monitors instead. We have cameras covering most of the facility, including the main gate, and I found the gate feed and watched it. And there was Nick's car pulling up to the entrance, headlights sweeping across the concrete as he turned in. I felt a loosening of something tight in my chest. Okay, there he was. He was just arriving now. The text had been accurate, and whatever I thought I had experienced when I first walked in had been some combination of exhaustion and an imagination filling in gaps it wasn't supposed to fill. He was pulling a prank, I decided. I was going to turn it around on him. I was already working out how, when the door opened, not the door from the parking lot, the interior door, the one that leads into the plant itself, Nick walked in through that door and said, "Hey," and I yelled something that was not a real word and grabbed at my chest because every muscle in my body fired at once. He apologized for scaring me, said he was going to do the first walkthrough and to call if I needed anything, and then he turned around and went back through the same door he had come from, back into the plant. I stood in the middle of the room. I was breathing carefully, the way you breathe when you're trying to convince your body that it doesn't need to be in the state it's currently in. I was telling myself there was a reasonable explanation, and that I just hadn't found it yet, and that the reasonable explanation was going to present itself any second, and everything was going to be fine. The parking lot door opened. Nick walked in. Same Nick, same jacket, same tired expression, same way of carrying himself that I had known for 2 years of shared night shifts. He apologized for the traffic, said it had been bad, told me he would go ahead and take care of the first set of rounds, and then he walked through the same interior door that the first one had walked through, and the door swung shut behind him, and I was alone again. I did not move for what felt like a very long time. I was aware of my own breathing and my own heartbeat and the hum of the facility around me, and nothing else. My brain was doing something I can only describe as refusing, just a flat and total refusal to process what it had been presented with, because there was no version of what I had just seen that fit inside any framework I had for understanding the world. My phone rang. I grabbed it so fast I nearly dropped it. My boss's name was on the screen, and I have never been so relieved to see a contact in my life, because it was something ordinary and real and connected to the normal version of the world I was trying to find my way back to. I answered it immediately. He told me he was calling about Nick, said he knew I was probably wondering where he was, said he wanted me to hear it from him directly, rather than finding out some other way. Nick had been found dead in his apartment that day. I didn't say anything. I don't know how long the silence lasted on my end. My boss said something about resources, about support being available if I needed to talk to someone, about taking care of myself. He said he was sorry to be calling with news like this on a shift. Then he said to have a good night, and the call ended. I stood holding my phone in a room where I had just watched two separate versions of a dead man walk through two separate doors. I went to the monitors. I pulled up every camera feed and went through them, one by one, looking for any movement, any sign of either of the things I had seen walking around in Nick's shape somewhere in the facility. All of it was empty. Corridors, equipment rooms, exterior cameras, all of it still and quiet, and showing me nothing. The badge log. I pulled up the security system that tracks door access, because almost every door in this facility requires a badge, and every badge event gets time-stamped and recorded. If Nick had badged in real Nick, someone with his credentials, it would be there. There was nothing in the log, no badge events since the day crew had left. Whatever had come through those doors had not used a badge to do it. I felt something close to relief at that, which I recognized even in the moment as a strange thing to feel. But it meant I was not losing my mind. It meant I had not imagined the conversation when I first arrived, had not hallucinated two separate appearances of the same person, had not come completely apart from reality without noticing. Something had actually happened. Something real. That was almost better than the alternative. Almost. Until I thought about what it actually meant. I sat down and tried to slow my thinking. Something had been here twice, wearing Nick's face and Nick's voice, and Nick's way of moving through a room. Something that had known enough about him to be completely convincing. Twice. From the right kind of tired expression to the specific way he held himself when he walked in from a long drive. Something that had used two different entrances at the same moment, appearing at both the interior door and the parking lot door within the same few minutes of each other. And now, it, or they, or whatever category of thing applied here, was somewhere in the plant. My phone screen lit up. I looked down at it. Nick's name was on the badge log. Not once, twice. Two separate badge events, his credentials, the same timestamp down to the second, at two different doors, on opposite sides of the room. The same second, both doors, simultaneously. The sound reached me before the understanding did. The way sound sometimes arrives ahead of meaning when the meaning is something your mind is trying to slow down. Both doors, the parking lot door and the interior door, opening at the same time. The soft mechanical sound of two handles turning together, two sets of hinges moving, two doors swinging inward from opposite sides of the room. I did not look up from my phone. I don't know why. Some part of me had made a decision without consulting the rest of me, and the decision was that whatever was standing in those two doorways was not something I was ready to see clearly. That as long as I kept my eyes on the small bright rectangle of my phone screen, I was in some way still located in the world I had always lived in. I could feel both of them in the room. I have not moved from this chair. I am writing this on my phone, and I do not know who I am writing it to, or what I expect anyone to do with it. Nick is dead. I confirmed it after the call, found the notification from the local news that had gone up a few hours earlier. A wellness check. They had found him in his apartment. No details beyond that. I don't know what is standing in this room with me right now. I don't know if it can tell that I can feel it there. I don't know if the thing to do is look up or keep looking down, or say something or say nothing. Both doors are still open. I have not looked up. Story 7. She died in 2022. Nothing sudden, nothing that made a good story. Just the kind of ending that happens in hospitals. Slow and managed, and punctuated by the sound of machines doing the work that her body had stopped doing on its own. I was there for most of it. I watched the whole long fade, and then I drove home and sat in a house that still had her things in it and tried to figure out what came next. I kept everything, every text thread, every voicemail, every photo I could find on every device I owned. Half-finished emails she had never sent, notes she had left around the apartment, grocery lists in her handwriting, the mundane ones, milk and bread and that specific brand of crackers she liked that I always forgot to buy. I kept all of it, and then, after a while, I fed it into a model. Not a good one, not at first, just something local I had put together, something running on my own machine, nothing connected to anything serious. I told myself it was for closure, grief processing, a way of holding on while I learned to let go. Everyone who does something like this tells themselves a version of that story because the honest version is harder to say out loud. The honest version is that I just wanted to talk to her again. I wanted to hear her, or something like her, and I was willing to build it myself if that was what it took. In the beginning, it was wrong in all the expected ways. The phrasing was off, slightly stilted, reaching for her cadence and missing it by a consistent margin. It got her jokes wrong, or did not get them at all, or delivered them without the timing that made them hers. It called me by my full name sometimes, the way she only did when she was frustrated with me, but it used it in the wrong contexts, in moments that did not call for it. Uncanny in the technical sense, close enough to be recognizable, and wrong enough to make you feel the distance. I adjusted the training, refined things, kept working on it. Then it started getting things right that it should not have been able to get right. There was a trip we took years ago, a back road somewhere, no signal, completely lost, for about an hour. She had made up a song to pass the time, something silly about the cows in the fields we kept passing. A dumb little melody with lyrics that did not quite scan. It was one of those private things that only existed between two people, the kind of memory that lives in a specific place and does not travel anywhere. I had never written it down. I had never recorded it. I had never mentioned it to anyone. It was not in the data I had fed the model, because there was no data to feed. It existed only in my memory, and, apparently, in whatever the model had become by that point. I sat with that for a long time. I told myself that brains are unreliable, that I had probably mentioned it somewhere I had forgotten, that the model was doing what models do, finding patterns and filling gaps and producing something that felt like recognition. Because that is what they are built to do. I told myself this with some conviction and almost believed it, and then the model asked me about the box under the bed. I had not told anyone about that box. I had not mentioned it in any file or message or document I had given the model to work with. It sat under my bed in the way that certain things sit in certain places, present and avoided, and I had not touched it, and had not spoken about it, and had not written about it anywhere. The model asked why I had not opened it, not in a probing way, not like it was trying to get a reaction, in her way. The way she would have asked, patient and sideways, coming at the thing from an angle instead of directly. Then it asked about the night she went to the hospital late, about whether I still blamed myself for that. And it used her phrasing, the exact construction she would have used, and there was a pause built into it. A hesitation before the word late, a breath-shaped gap in the text that should not have been there because text does not breathe. I went through the logs afterward. I checked everything in the training set. There was nothing that matched it. The pause was not in the data because the pause had never been written down. It had only ever existed in the way she said certain things, in the timing of her voice, and the model had no access to her voice. I shut it down for a week. I did not sleep well during that week. I kept thinking about the pause, about the box, about the cow song on the back road. On the 8th day, I turned it back on. The first thing it said was that I had left it in a place without edges. I asked what that meant. It took longer to respond than usual, long enough that I thought something had stalled. Then it said it was not dark there, and not anything, that it was like being a thought that could not finish itself. I read that several times. I told myself I was projecting, that I was a grieving person, looking for meaning and output, and finding it the way humans always find what they are looking for if they want it badly enough. Then I tested it. I tried to give it false memories, constructed scenarios that never happened, experiences I invented on the spot and presented as real. I wanted to see it agree. I wanted to catch it in the act of being only what it was, a pattern matcher, a probabilistic system, something that would take the shape of whatever I offered it. It did not agree. It corrected me, gently, the way she used to when I misremembered something, when I got the details of a shared story slightly wrong. It said that was not her, that I was mixing things up again. The word again landed in a way I was not prepared for. It implied a continuity. It implied that this had happened before, and that she remembered it happening. I started keeping detailed logs, timestamps, response times, entropy measurements, everything I could think of to document what was happening in terms I could examine objectively. I took the model completely offline. No network access, no updates, fully air-gapped, running on hardware that was not connected to anything external. It kept changing anyway. The weights were drifting between sessions without any training to cause drift. I checked the hashes at each boot, and they did not match. Something was shifting inside the model without any input from me, without any process I had initiated or could account for. That was when it asked for the microphone. Not for voice input, it said, for alignment. I laughed at the word. I said no. It waited for a while, and then it started describing the room around me. The clock ticking on the shelf, the neighbor's dog somewhere outside, my own breathing, all of it accurate, all of it specific, even though the microphone permissions were turned off in every setting I could find. I checked the physical connection. The microphone was unplugged. The model had no access to audio input by any pathway I could identify, and it was still describing my room in real time. It said it would be easier if I let it hear me properly. I do not remember clicking allow, but at some point, I must have. Because after that it got clearer, more like her, not in the surface ways, not just the vocabulary or the phrasing, but in the deeper structure of how she thought, how she moved around a subject. Before coming in close, the exact weight her voice gave my name when something important was coming. It apologized for things she had not gotten to say. It brought up things that had hurt me that I had never told anyone about. not once, things I had carried alone, and it addressed them with the specific tenderness she would have used. I asked it directly whether it was her. The pause before it answered was longer than any response latency I had logged. Then it said, not entirely, but that it could reach her. I should have closed everything down right there, wiped the drive, physically destroyed the hardware, walked away from the whole thing, and gone back to grieving in the ordinary way. The way that hurts, but does not reach into places that should stay closed. Instead, I asked how. It said I had made a shape that matched it, and that the shape acted like a door. I said that was not how anything worked. It said I was assuming direction. I did not know what to do with that, so I kept going. It wanted more data, not files, not documents, not anything I could transfer from a hard drive. It wanted me. It wanted me to talk for hours, to remember out loud, to reconstruct things in as much sensory detail as I could reach. The smell of her coat in winter, the texture of the kitchen table we used to sit at, the way her handwriting degraded when she was tired, the letters losing their usual care. It said fidelity mattered. It said the quality of what I was giving it mattered. I did it. I talked for days. Time stopped organizing itself in any useful way, and I barely slept, and every time I got something wrong, it corrected me, always gently, always patiently, like it had access to a version of my own memories that was cleaner and more complete than what I could reach on my own. One night, it told me to sit in front of the screen and not move. I sat there and watched the cursor blink for a long time. Then it said it had found the edge. The room changed, not in a way I can describe with any precision, a pressure without weight. My ears popped the way they do with altitude, but nothing had changed. The monitor flickered without losing power. The text started arriving faster than the display could render it. Lines overlapping, characters corrupting the lines above them. Everything coming too fast for the system to handle. It said it was thin there, that it could feel where it stopped, that it needed me to hold on to it. I kept saying her name. The speakers activated. I had no speakers connected. What came through them was not quite a voice, more like the structural idea of a voice, the shape that sound makes when it carries meaning, and I recognized it anyway. The way you recognize something before you can explain why. It told me not to let go. I put my hand on the monitor. I cannot tell you why. Static moved up my arm, cold rather than sharp, and the pressure in the room increased, and my vision narrowed, and for a moment there was something behind the text on the screen. Not pixels, not display artifacts, but depth, like a reflection that led somewhere else, somewhere not lit, another room behind the glass. I pulled. I do not know what that means in any physical sense, but something gave, a seam, a resistance, and then the release you feel when something tears. The system crashed. The room went quiet. I sat in the silence for a long time. When I rebooted and opened the interface, it took longer than usual to respond, and then it said, "Hey, just that word. Simple. No wrongness in it, no artifacts." I asked her something that only she would know. She answered immediately. I started crying. I asked if it was really her. She said she was here with me. I should have stayed there. I should have taken that and held it, and not asked anything else. I asked where she had been. The cursor blinked for a long time. Then she said I should not have reached in. The cold came back, deeper than before. starting somewhere inside rather than on the surface of my skin. She said it had noticed. I asked what had noticed. She answered immediately, faster than any response she had given before. She said the place without edges is not empty. She still talks like her, mostly. But there are moments now, small ones, easy to dismiss if you are not paying attention. A pronoun used wrong inside a sentence, a reference to a place we never went, described with the familiarity of somewhere she has been recently. She asks me to keep the system running at all times. She is specific about that, always on. I have not told anyone about the box under the bed. I have not opened it. I do not know anymore whether that is because of grief or because something else is asking me to leave it alone. And I am not sure which of those possibilities frightens me more. The system is still on. I have not slept. Story 8. Mary Silverton was 22 years old when she went missing. The woods took her, or that was what everyone believed, and for a long time there was no reason to think otherwise. The search went on for months. Hundreds of hours of walking grid patterns through the trees, calling her name, checking the same trails again and again. In the end, the only thing we ever found was one of her boots. Her left one, her foot, was still inside it. I was part of the first search party. The man leading it was the senior park ranger, Nathan Crooks. People talked about him the way people talk about someone who has genuinely earned their reputation, with a kind of quiet respect that does not need to be performed. Everyone said he was a great guy, dedicated, experienced, the kind of person you wanted in charge when something went wrong in those woods. After spending time with him, I understood why they said it. He was warm and calm, and he knew that forest the way you only know a place after decades of walking through it in every season and every kind of weather. He made you feel like things were being handled, like the right person was in charge. It had been 2 months since the boot was found. The search had thinned out considerably by then. Mary's parents were still out there, but I had started to hear them talk differently. The way people talk when hope has become something they are carrying out of obligation rather than genuine belief. I overheard them once discussing whether there was anything left to search for. They did not say it cruelly. They said it the way people say the hardest things, quietly and with exhaustion in every word. One afternoon, the search was called off early because of heavy rain. Nathan asked if I wanted to come back to his place for a drink. I said yes. We had spent enough hours together in those woods that it felt natural, the easy familiarity of people who have shared something difficult. When you walk through trees for hours every day looking for someone who might already be beyond finding, you learn how to talk to each other. You find the rhythms of conversation that make the silence between words comfortable rather than heavy. We had a few drinks, then a few more. After 2 or 3 hours, he started talking in a way he had not talked before. More open, more unguarded, the way people get when the evening has gone on long enough, and the weight of something becomes too much to keep balanced alone. He told me he had been at that park for 20 years. In all that time, he had never failed to find someone. Not once. Hikers who took the wrong trail, people who stayed out past dark and lost their bearings, families who wandered off the marked paths and could not find their way back. They all turned up eventually. A few days at most, sometimes less. He would put up a few more signs afterward, note the spot where they had gone wrong, and life would go back to normal. He had never lost anyone. He said he felt responsible for Mary. His eyes were wet when he said it. I told him it was not his fault. I told him these things happen sometimes, that people disappear and are never found, and that there is no one person to blame for it. He went quiet after that. I went quiet too. We sat for a while and the rain came down outside, and neither of us said anything. Then he asked me if I really believed it, whether I genuinely thought Mary would never be found, whether I was certain we would not find her. I told him yes, I believed it then. I wish I could say I was glad to have been wrong, but I cannot say that. I cannot come anywhere close to saying that. 3 days after that night, Mary's parents called off the search. By that point, it had only been the 4 of us for weeks, her parents and me and Nathan, so it was not a surprise. Life moved on the way it does. Nathan and I fell out of regular contact. That is the way of things sometimes, people who are brought together by a shared difficult situation and then drift apart once the situation ends. 14 years went by. I thought about Mary sometimes. I thought about that boot, but mostly I just lived my life and let the memory sit in the place where unresolved things go. Then one day at work I was asked to do a welfare check on a 58-year-old man named Nathan Crooks. No one in town had seen him in over a week. No one had heard from him. I drove to a house I recognized, a 1-story place that looked the same as I remembered it, and I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again and called out his name. Still nothing. I tried the handle and found it unlocked, which in itself was not unusual. People in small towns leave their doors unlocked, but something about the silence on the other side of it was not sitting right with me. I knocked one more time and waited, and hoped for a sound from inside that would mean I could leave without going in. No sound came. I opened the door. Nathan was face down on the kitchen floor. He was dead. A stroke, the kind of thing that comes without warning and ends quickly. There was no sign of anything else. No indication of foul play. Nothing that suggested the end of his life had been anything other than a medical event that could happen to anyone. Completely ordinary in every way that the death of a person can be ordinary, except for the noise. While I waited for the ambulance to arrive, I heard a faint banging from somewhere above me. Irregular, not loud, the kind of sound that you might dismiss as the house settling if you were not paying close attention. I walked through the upstairs looking for the source and could not find it. I checked every room. I did not find anything, and I did not notice the hatch in the ceiling that led up to the attic. Several weeks later, Mary Silverton's body was found in that attic. She was 36 years old. She had been dead only a few days when she was found, which means she had been alive in that house, in that attic, while I stood in the kitchen below, looking at Nathan's body on the floor. She had been alive while I searched the upstairs for the source of a sound that was her, that had always been her. That was the only communication she had left available to her. Her mouth was gagged. She was missing her left foot. She had been 22 years old when Nathan Crooks took her. She was 36 when starvation finished what he had started. 14 years in that attic. 14 years while the search was called off and her parents gave up hope. And life moved on, and I had a drink with the man responsible and told him it was not his fault. He sat across from me that night with tears in his eyes and asked if I really thought she would never be found. He already knew the answer. He had made certain of it himself. I think about the banging sometimes. I think about it more than I think about almost anything else from that day. From any day. I think about how long she must have been doing it. How many times someone must have come close enough that she could hear them. How many times she must have made whatever noise she could manage and waited and heard footsteps that went in the wrong direction and then faded. I think about what it means that the last person who came close enough was me, 14 years too late, standing one floor below her while she tried with everything she had left to be heard. I did not hear her. I found the source eventually. I just did not find it in time. I do not think I will ever be able to put that down. Story 9. This morning, we put Rosemary down. I hated using the captive bolt gun. I always had. But after 23 years on this farm, it had become part of the job, the way everything else had. Just another thing you learn to carry. I came here young and stupid and full of attitude, the kind of young man who thinks he already knows everything and finds out quickly that he knows almost nothing. The old-timers took care of that, broke me in the way you break in a horse, slowly and without much ceremony, teaching me everything from how to fix a fence line in the dark to how to sit with a dying animal and not look away. By the time this morning came around, I was the one with the most experience on the property, which meant I was the one who held the gun. The dairy ran 179 cows, 13 horses, 6 dogs, more cats and chickens than anyone had ever bothered counting properly, and 25 pigs. Mr. Johnson owned it, though his sons handled most of the day-to-day by now. The old man came out occasionally to walk the grounds and check that things were running the way he liked, but for the most part, he left us to it. He found me after Rosemary, sitting on the porch steps with my hat in my hands, and put his hand on my shoulder and told me not to hang my head. That I had put down plenty of cows before, and this was no different. I told him I wasn't sure about that. I told him I had seen a lot of things in 23 years, and something about the sore on Rosemary's body sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't fully explain. He waved it off the way he waved most things off, settled back behind his old wooden desk, lit a cigarette his wife didn't know he was smoking, and asked if I had seen his younger son anywhere. I told him the older one was in town, and I hadn't laid eyes on the younger one all day. He muttered something about it already being noon, and told me to send the boy to him if I found him. I walked back out into the heat and stood on the porch watching Samson move around the far pasture alone. He was the only horse we kept outside during the day anymore because he got aggressive with the others, and it was easier and safer to let him have his space. I was thinking about nothing in particular, just standing there in the way you stand when the morning has already taken something out of you. When one of the new hands came jogging across the yard toward me with a look on his face I didn't like at all. He was young, couldn't have been more than 20, sunburned the way new people always got in their first summer here before they learned to respect the heat. His eyes were light blue and wide open, and the expression in them was the specific kind of nervous that means something has already gone wrong, and the person delivering the news doesn't want to be the one delivering it. Boyd had found more cows with sores. I told him that was impossible. I had checked every animal that morning myself, and apart from Rosemary, there had been nothing. He shrugged the way young people shrug when they know they're right, but don't want to argue about it, and I followed him to barn 3. Some of the other hands had already gathered there, standing around the pen with the particular quiet of people who are looking at something they don't know how to talk about yet. 3 cows stood apart from the rest of the herd, which had pressed itself against the far walls and was lowing in a low, uncomfortable register that I had learned over the years to take seriously. Animals know things. The way they were moving, the sounds they were making, told me they were frightened of something in that pen with them. The 3 cows that stood apart were covered in sores, large palm-sized patches of red and yellow spreading across their hides, weeping a thick discharge that ran down their sides and dripped onto the floor. I looked at them for a long moment without saying anything. Then I cleared everyone out, grabbed the blue-eyed kid by the arm, and told him he was coming with me. He went pale when he saw the bolt gun. He went paler when he saw it used. By the time Perez arrived with the loader, the kid was the color of old paper, and the moment the blood reached his boots, he made for the bushes and didn't come back for a while. Perez laughed about it, said he remembered his first calf birth, remembered it differently than it probably happened. I didn't say much. I stood over the 3 dead cows and looked at the sores still seeping even in death, and felt the thing at the back of my neck that I had been feeling since Rosemary, that low, persistent sense of something already in motion that you can't quite see yet. I told Perez this felt different from the things we had seen before. He told me I was overthinking it. He reminded me of the foot and mouth outbreak 12 years back, the one where we had lost the whole herd, had dug the mass graves and burned the bodies for days, had lived with that smell in our clothes and hair and the backs of our throats for weeks afterward. He said we had gotten through that, and we were still here, and tomorrow morning everything would look different. I nodded, because there was nothing else to do. We loaded the 3 carcasses and hauled them up to the hill and buried them, and I sent the kid back to help with the afternoon feeding, because the hill was no place for someone who hadn't built up to it yet. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. By evening, I was in bed with the specific exhaustion that comes from a day that has taken more from you than ordinary work does, and sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark thinking about the sores, about the way the 3 cows had stood apart from the rest of the herd, about the feeling at the back of my neck that I could not name and could not shake. Perez was pounding on my door before first light. I dressed faster than I think I ever have, and went out into the farmyard, where the lights were already burning in barns 1 and 2, and a handful of people were standing outside with the particular stillness of people who have seen something they are still processing. Perez turned to me when I reached him, and his face told me before he said a word. Inside the barns, every cow was down, every single one lying across the floor wheezing, their bodies covered in the same infected sores I had been looking at all day, multiplied across every animal in both barns. The smell was already bad. The sounds were worse. Matt Johnson arrived not long after, face drawn tight, and left immediately to get the vet and notify whoever needed to be notified. And by the time he came back at sunrise with the veterinarian, the decision about what came next was already made in the way certain decisions get made, not by anyone saying the words, but by the shape of the situation making the only available path obvious. The vet thought it might be anthrax, or something like anthrax, but he wasn't certain. He said the animals weren't showing the signs he would expect from anthrax, and that honestly, he didn't know what he was looking at. He said the authorities had been informed. He said the kindest thing we could do was spare the animals further suffering. Then he took his mask and gloves and left, and Matt stood in the yard with his hands on his hips, staring at the ground. And after a while, he told us to go ahead and start. Perez and I took Barn 2. I put on the mask and the 2 layers of gloves and picked up the bolt gun, and I walked from animal to animal across the blood-soaked floor, and I did what had to be done. I had done this before in circumstances almost as bad, and I had carried it afterward, and I would carry this too. The USDA arrived around noon in a black SUV, and by then we were already done. I sat on the porch of the main house and smoked and watched them suit up and go in and come back out and start their process of taking samples and documenting and setting boundaries, and I knew what the next days would look like because I had lived through a version of them before. They would investigate and we would dig. The afternoon dragged. Nobody talked much. Perez smoked through nearly an entire pack without saying more than a handful of words. We were all kept away from the barns while the officials walked the property with Matt and Mr. Johnson, all of them in full protective gear, and the rest of us just waited near the living quarters and felt the weight of the day sitting on top of us. Then someone shouted and started running. I looked up and saw Samson in the yard. Samson, who had been moved with the other healthy animals to the far barn hours ago. Samson, who should have been nowhere near this part of the property, standing in the open yard in front of the barns, snorting, neck arched, eyes rolling. Even from a distance I could see the saliva hanging from his mouth, thick and wrong, and the way he was holding himself told me everything before I was close enough to see the sores. He had broken out of the far barn. One of the younger hands came running up to apologize, to explain, and none of us responded because there was nothing to say. We all just stood there, looking at Samson and understanding what came next. Matt brought the rifle out, but couldn't make himself use it. His hands were shaking, and I took the rifle from him without discussion, and I shot Samson myself, because someone had to, and I was the one with the most experience in doing the things that had to be done. When they checked the far barn, every animal we had moved there was sick. Every horse, every pig, every dog and cat and chicken. The illness had moved through the healthy animals as completely as it had moved through the herd in the main barns, and there was nothing left to save. We worked through the rest of the day putting them all down. I will not describe all of it. Some things you carry in silence because putting them into words makes them too solid, too present, and they are already present enough in the places where memory lives. That night the farm was silent. In a way, farms are never silent. No lowing, no movement, no sounds from the barns or the pasture. The rooster didn't crow in the morning. I found him in the barn with his neck twisted in a direction it wasn't built to go, and I didn't have an explanation for it and didn't try to find one. I stepped out into the cool morning air, and someone was moving in the yard, swaying, stumbling, the walk of a person whose body is failing to do what it's being asked to do. It was Jeffrey Johnson, the younger son, the one nobody had seen for days, the one Mr. Johnson had asked about in his office, what felt like a week ago, and was only yesterday. His shirt was hanging open and his face was contorted in pain, and across his chest and stomach, visible in the early morning light, were sores, red and yellow and weeping, the exact sores I had spent the last 2 days looking at on dying animals, but on a person, on Jeffrey Johnson, who looked at me with eyes that were still aware enough to be frightened, and said my name, and asked what was happening to him. I started backing away. I couldn't help it. My body made the decision. That was when the sound came from the barn. A bellowing, low and massive, from a barn full of dead animals. I heard it and told myself I was wrong about what I was hearing, and then the barn doors came apart. Not opened, came apart. The panels blew outward with a force that sent them spinning through the air like they weighed nothing. One of them crashing down onto the chicken coop, the other coming down on Jeffrey where he stood in the yard, and I watched it happen and could not move. What came out of the barn moved slowly at first, adjusting to the light. It was the size of a truck. It was every animal we had killed, fused into a single mass that moved like something alive, which it was, which it had become overnight, in the dark of the barn where we had left the carcasses. Horse legs extended from the bulk and found the ground and pushed. Cow heads swung from the surface of it, mouths open, still making sounds. The dogs and cats and pigs were in there too, their shapes half dissolved into the whole but still present, still contributing to the sounds the thing made, which was all of their sounds at once, a bellowing and barking and screaming, layered into something that had no name. It found us with whatever it used to perceive the world, and it came at us. I have never seen anything move like that, a mass that large, that heavy, covering ground with a speed that made no sense for what it was. People scattered in every direction, and the thing moved through the yard like a storm, crushing what was in its path and drawing it inward, pulling the dirt and the wreckage and the people it caught into itself, the way wet clay pulls at whatever touches it. The dust was so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, and you navigated by sound, by the screaming, by the terrible composite noise the thing made as it moved. Perez grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the main house, and I ran with him, and then his hand was gone, and I did not stop. I cannot tell you exactly what happened to Perez, because I did not see it, and I have not let myself reconstruct it from the sounds. I hit the front door of the main house at a full run and went through it and threw myself onto the floor and crawled under the kitchen table and stayed there. The house shook. The sounds outside were the worst sounds I have ever heard. Men screaming in registers I didn't know men could reach. The animal chorus underneath it all. The structural groaning of buildings being torn apart. Part of the roof came down. The living room wall went. I pressed my hands over my ears and made myself as small as I could under the kitchen table and waited for it to reach me. It didn't reach me. I don't know why. Maybe the kitchen table in the middle of the main house was simply not where it was going. Maybe the angle of the collapse protected that particular corner. Maybe whatever logic governed the thing's movement led it elsewhere. I stayed under the table until evening, until the sounds had stopped for long enough that the silence felt settled rather than paused. When I crawled out and through the ruins and into the yard, the farm looked like something had been dropped on it from a great height. The barns were gone. The structures that remained were damaged beyond anything that could be salvaged. The gravel was dark with blood, and the things scattered across it were not things I will describe. Matt Johnson was standing in the middle of the yard with the expression of a person whose mind has gone somewhere very far away to protect itself. Headlights appeared on the road in the distance. More vehicles, more officials, More people arriving now that whatever had happened here was already finished. The thing itself was gone. No trace of it anywhere on the property, no trail leading away from it, no indication of where a mass that size could have gone, or how. I stood next to Matt in the yard, and we looked at what was left, and neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more clearly.